Now I'll be going over the various enemies that make up the Centipede game and how I implemented them. To start with, I have the enemy factory, which keeps track of all enemies, which include centipedes, the spiders, the scorpion, and the flea. The enemy factory has lists for all these things. It doesn't have a centipede list, which has a head list, a tail list, which have active and reserves, flea active reserves, scorpion active and reserve, and spider active and reserve, to keep track of and recycle all of the enemies on the field. Also, besides doing this through a recycle and spawn function for each respective enemy, it also has a clear enemies function, which does an overall wipe of all enemies on the field, which is needed for transitioning between deaths, like the player deaths, and between like attractor to player 1 mode, and vice versa in reverse. All these functions are generally the same in that they check to see the size of a reserve, if there's any available space. I mean, if the reserve is less than 0, it has to spawn a new head, for instance, in this case. But if it's greater than 0, that means there's something on the reserve, so it takes it from the reserve and moves it to the active and tracks it on the active, and then it reactivates that that specific enemy using its own setup call that's built into the enemy. The centipede is broken up into a head and a tail, which inherits from the centipede itself. The centipede, the overarching class, controls the collisions, setting up certain things like the manager attached to it, setting up the sprites because that's always the same, creating the mushroom, and setting speed and position. The reason it's not more is because the tail really doesn't need more, so therefore, yeah, sorry about that. So therefore, I mean, it's not that much, but it does give the overall functions that's needed from there. The head is the controller of the centipede, is the main part. It creates the cue, which it then pushes down to the tail to create that linked movement motion. Here you can see the setup that I call. This is the setup that I call in the initialization, and every time I need to reuse a head to set up all the proper parts to make it work and move as it needs to be. It needs to keep track of if it's going to be oscillating or not in the player zone, its position, its speed that it gets in from the wave manager, from the text file. BP stands for body parts, how many body parts it'll have, and also its initial direction of X, whether it's positive or negative, left or right. It also sets up rotations, min, max, like areas, and the such. Here's the update for the head. Just if it makes I use basically alarms to control all of its movements, like all the enemies, in order to make it more efficient. So as such, it only does the updates. It then moves through, moves in X, and then if it's turning, it turns. The direct is like positive for right and negative for left. If when it's turning, it sets that to 0, and then only does Y movement, which is doing the turning maneuver, which also controls its rotation when it does that, and then it updates the cue at the end, and then sets its position. To go through the movement, here's the alarm 0. This is what I use to pass the cue to the next body part, and it resets itself. It'll call it the first time, but if there's no next, then it'll just stop doing it. Here is my alarm 1, which starts the turning cycle. If it's enraged and not enraged, or oscillating and not oscillating, it varies. And then calls alarm 2, which it sets up the timer for alarm 2. Alarm 2 is basically the call that's made that finishes out the whole entire thing and makes sure it's on the right axis, I mean the right row, like that's divisible by 16, which is the grid size. in this case. The rotation's all right, it's all lined up properly, and all that stuff. Also, I have a temp invulnerable alarm. Temp invulnerable makes it so that the centipede can hit a mushroom and then like turn and then not immediately collide into the next mushroom or onto the mushroom itself multiple times and stuff like that, to give it the real motion that you see in the game. Here you can see the crate body. This is called in during the setup. Basically, if it's by parts 0, it's next 0. It's not equal, then it goes through this, which basically spawns a tail and then links it all together with the next previous and the head. I set all that up, and then once it sets up that first part, it minuses the body parts, and then it keeps looping through and doing it. And here's the cleanup, which first, make it inactive so that when it's off the screen it doesn't go moving around and all that stuff. Set the alarms, cancel all the alarms so nothing weird happens when it's off screen. And then goes through this thing to check basically if there's the right situations to spawn the new head. Like if there's like a next body part and that next has a next, and check all that stuff to properly link it up. Like if there's no body parts after the next one, then you don't have to keep linking down because there's nothing left. But if there is, you do. If there's nothing after it, then just don't worry about it. And clear its instructions and all that stuff. Basically set it up so that next time it's called, there's no lingering data in there to cause weird behaviors from splitting and such. And that is basically it for the head. Tail's really simple. It just, when it's spawned, it makes sure it links up to the proper parts, and then once that's done, if it has instructions, it follows them. If it doesn't do anything. And if it's destroyed, the only thing it gets complicated, you basically have and the same thing as the head, you have to properly spawn the next head and link it up behind it and all that stuff if you kill it. And this is just a pass where it passes down. It gets called and passes down the list. That's basically it for the centipede. Spider, all this is just, general setup stuff. I use alarms again that are specifically timed to create the proper actions instead of doing the update. All the alarms do to create the actions properly is adjust direction Y and direction X for left, right, up, down. I really like this just because I can set, when I only want to go up and down, you set dir X to 0, and then this basically does nothing, and then you get the right motions, etc. Cancel alarms on that, recycle. Here I do a quick check because the bullet contains the ship it's from, so I can do a quick distance check. I don't do a full distance formula, I just do square root unsquare rooted distance basically, because it's the same thing in this situation, and it's more efficient than doing square roots all the time. This makes a call to the score manager that I'll be going over later, and gives it the proper enum to set the score accordingly. I have 2 alarms. One is on a random timer, and the other one is on a set timer. And I do this in order so that if it's on the set timer, no matter what, when it reaches the top of its zone from the calculations, or it reaches the right point from its calculations, it'll always stay within the zone. But the RAM timer might get called over it and then reset everything, and now we called at a RAM value, of course, and now make it get that erratic motion. My spider goes, it only goes in one direction. It goes diagonal on the ups and straight down on the downs, but there are occasions where it'll do a repeat, which is also set off of a random calculation. And then if it repeats, chance to repeat true, it'll go up and down once, and then it'll keep going along its merry way. So I do have that functionality for the spider. Scorpion just goes across the screen, either left or right, in the zone, touches a mushroom, mushroom's poisoned. Pretty straightforward. It's destroyed on an alarm, as you can just calculate how long it'll take it to get from where it spawns to where it needs to be off the screen. Flea is spawned based off of a spawn timer in my spawn manager. That'll be called from the mushroom factory, actually, on a mushrooms recycle. If the number of mushrooms in the player zone is less than the flea spawn number, then it will spawn a flea. And then the flea just goes down the screen, directly down, and it will call drop mushroom. Actually, this is the old one, because now I use alarms instead. So this, if you look at the update, never called. Just kind of there in case, maybe, I don't know. But drop mushroom just goes, gotta go the alarm. It just keeps going down, and it makes sure it's on the grid, and then there's a drop chance, basically, and that you can control this drop chance formula from my constants, so it's a little bit easier to do all that stuff. And that's all the enemies.